It was actually Buandulino who interrupted himself every now and then to discover what that master of beauty was doing. For example, when he took a lizard from a pot, chopped off its head and tail, almost minced the rest, and set this paste to cook in a little pan of oil. What a question. It was the decoction meant to keep alive the few hairs that Nikita's still bore on his pate and make them shiny and perfumed. And that phial? Why, it contained essences of nutmeg or cardamom, or rosé water, each to restore vigor to a part of the face. That thick honey was to strengthen the lips, and this other one, whose secret he could not reveal, was to harden the gums. In the end Nikita's was splendid, as a judge of the veil should be in a logothete of the secrets, and as if reborn, he shone in his own light on that wan morning, against the frowning background of Byzantium smoldering in agony. And Buandulino felt a certain embarrassment in telling about his adolescent life in a monastery of Latins, cold and inhospitable, where Otto's health obliged the youth to share meals composed of boiled vegetables and insipid broth. That year Buandulino had to spend little time at court, where, when he had to be there, he wandered around shyly, yearning at the same time to encounter Beatrice, and all was torment. Frederick first had to settle things with the Poles, Polanos de Polonia, wrote Otto, gens quasi barbara ad pugnandum promptissima. In March he convened a new diet at Worms to prepare for another descent into Italy, where Milan, as usual, with her allies, was becoming more and more unruly, then a diet at Herbipolis in September, and one in Besançon in October. In short, he seemed possessed. Buandulino for the most part remained in the Abbey of Moormond with Otto, continued his studies with Rehuin, and acted as copyist for the bishop, who was increasingly frail. When they arrived at that book of the Chronica that tells of Presbyter Johannes, Buandulino asked what it meant to be a Christian, said Nestorianus. Were these Nestorians then a bit Christian and a bit not? My son, in plain words, Nestorius was a heretic, but we owe him much gratitude. You should know that in India, after the preaching of the Apostle Thomas, it was the Nestorians who spread the Christian religion. Nestorius committed only one error, but a very grave one, concerning Jesus Christ our Lord and his most holy mother. You see, we firmly believe that there exists a single divine nature and that nevertheless the Trinity, within the unity of this nature, is composed of three distinct persons, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. But we believe further that in Christ there was a sole person, the Divine One, and two natures, the human and the divine. Nestorius on the contrary sustained that in Christ there are, indeed, two natures, human and divine, but there are also two persons. So Maria had begotten only the human person and could not thus be called the mother of God, but only the mother of Christ the man, not Theotokos, or God-bearer, she who has begotten God, but at most Christotokos. Is it bad to think that? It's bad and it isn't. Otto became impatient. You can still love the Blessed Virgin even if you consider her as Nestorius did, but it is certain that you are paying her less honor. And besides, the person is the individual substance of a rational being, and if in Christ there were two persons, were there then two individual substances of two rational beings? Where would this all end? Would we be saying that Jesus one day reasoned in one way and the next day in another? This said, it isn't that Presbyter Johannes is a perfidious heretic, but it would be well for him to enter into contact with a Christian emperor who would make him appreciate the true faith, and since he is surely an honest man, he could only be converted. However, it is certain that if you don't set yourself to studying a bit of theology, you will never understand these things. You are quick-witted. Rehuin is a good teacher as far as reading and writing go, and doing sums, and learning a few rules of grammar. But trivium and quadrivium are a different matter. To arrive at theology you should study dialectics, and these are things you cannot learn here at Moormond. You must go off to some studium, one of those schools that exist only in the great cities. But I don't want to go to a studium, whatever that is. When you understand what it is, you'll be pleased to go. You see, my son, everyone is accustomed to saying that the human community is based on three forces, warriors, monks, and peasants, and this may have been true until yesterday. But we live in new times, in which the man of learning is becoming equally important, even if he is not a monk but a man who studies law, philosophy, the movement of the stars, and many other things, and who doesn't always give an account of what he is doing to his bishop or to his king. And these studia, which are slowly growing up in Bologna and in Paris, are places where learning is cultivated and transmitted, and learning is a form of power. I was a pupil of the great Abelard. May God have mercy on this man who sinned greatly but also suffered and expiated. After his misfortune, when through a bitter vendetta he was robbed of his virility, he became a monk, an abbé, and lived apart from the world. At the peak of his glory he was a master in Paris, worshipped by his students, and respected by the mighty precisely because of his learning. Buandulino told himself he would never leave Otto, from whom he continued to learn so many things. But before the trees had blossomed for the fourth time since Buandulino had met him, Otto was reduced to a shadow of himself by malarial fevers, pains in all his joints, fluxions of the chest, not to mention gallstone. Numerous physicians, including some Arabs and some Jews, and therefore the best that a Christian emperor could offer a bishop, had tormented his now fragile body with countless leeches, but, for reasons that those pillars of wisdom were unable to explain, after almost all his blood had been extracted, he was worse than if they had left him with it. Otto first called Rehuin to his bedside, to entrust to him the continuation of his account of the feats of Frederick, assuring him that it was easy. He should narrate the events and put in the emperor's mouth speeches drawn from the texts of the ancients. Then he summoned Buandulino. Puer delectissime, he said to him, I am going away. You might even say I am going back, and I'm not sure which expression is the more appropriate, since I am not sure whether my story of the two cities is more true or the story of the feats of Frederick. You must understand, Master Nikitas, Buandulino said, the life of a boy can be marked by the confession of a dying teacher who can no longer distinguish between two truths. It's not that I am content to go away, or back, as it so pleases the Lord, and if I were to question his decrees, there's the risk he might strike me dead at this very instant, so it's best to take advantage of the little time he is granting me. Listen, you know how I have tried to make the Emperor understand the reasoning of the cities beyond the Alps. The Emperor can do nothing but subject them to his rule. However, there are many ways to acknowledge submission, and perhaps a way can be found other than the way of siege and massacre. So you, who have the Emperor's ear, and who are still a son of those lands, must try to do your best to reconcile the demands of our Lord with those of your cities, so that the smallest possible number of people may die, and that finally all may be content. To do this you must learn to use your reason properly, and I have asked the Emperor to send you to study in Paris. Not in Bologna, where they concern themselves only with law. A rogue like you should never stick his nose into the Pandex, because with the law there can be no lying. In Paris you will study rhetoric and you will read the poets. Rhetoric is the art of saying well that which may or may not be true, and it is the duty of poets to invent beautiful falsehoods. It would also be well for you to study a bit of theology, but without trying to become a theologian, because there must be no joking with the things of Almighty God. Study enough so that you will afterwards cut a fine figure at court, where you will surely become a ministerial, which is the highest rank the son of peasants can aspire to. You will be like a knight, the peer of many nobles, and you will be able to serve faithfully your adoptive father. Do all this in memory of me, and Jesus forgive me if, without meaning to, I have used his words. Then he emitted a rattle, and lay immobile. Buandulino was about to close Otto's eyes, believing he had heaved his last sigh, but suddenly the older man reopened his mouth and whispered, exploiting his final breath, Buandulino, remember the kingdom of the presbyter Johannes. Only in seeking it can the oriflammes of Christianity go beyond Byzantium and Jerusalem. I have heard you invent many stories that the emperor has believed. So then, if you have no other news of that realm, invent some. Mind you, I am not asking you to bear witness to what you believe false, which would be a sin, but to testify falsely to what you believe true, which is a virtuous act because it compensates for the lack of proof of something that certainly exists or happened. I beseech you. There is surely a Johannes, beyond the lands of the Persians and the Armenians, beyond Bakhtu, Ecbatana, Persepolis, Susa, and Arbela, descendant of the Magi. Press Frederick to the east, because from there comes the light that will illuminate him as the greatest of all kings. Take the emperor out of that mire that stretches between Milan and Rome. He could remain trapped in it until his death. Keep clear of a kingdom even where a pope rules. He will always be only half an emperor. Remember, Buandulino, presbyter Johannes, the way to the east. But why are you saying this to me, master, and not to Rehuin? Because Rehuin has no imagination. He can recount only what he has seen, and at times not even that, because he doesn't understand what he has seen. But you can imagine what you haven't seen. Oh, why has it become so dark? Buandulino, who was a liar, told him not to worry, because night was falling. Just as noon was striking, Otto exhaled a hiss from his now hoarse throat, and his eyes remained open and fixed, as if he were looking at his Prester John enthroned. Buandulino closed his teacher's eyes, and shed honest tears. Saddened by Otto's death, Buandulino went back to Frederick for a few months. At first he consoled himself with the thought that, seeing the emperor again, he would also see the empress. He saw her, and was saddened still more. We must not forget that Buandulino was approaching his 16th year, and if, before, his falling in love might have seemed a boyish perturbation, of which he himself understood very little, now it was becoming conscious desire and complete torment. Rather than remain at court and languish, he always followed Frederick into the field, and he had witnessed things he was far from liking. The Milanese destroyed Lodi for the second time, or rather, first they sacked it, taking away livestock, forage, and goods from every household. Then they drove all the citizens outside the walls, telling them that if they didn't clear out to hell and gone, every last one of them would taste the sword. Women, old people, and children, including babes still in the cradle. The citizens of Lodi abandoned in the city only their dogs, and went off into the countryside, on foot, under the rain, even the nobles, who had been deprived of their horses, and the women with infants at their breast, and at times they fell by the wayside, or rolled brutally into the ditches. They took refuge between the Adda and the Sirio. There they managed to find only some hovels where they slept, piled one upon another. This in no way placated the Milanese, who came back to Lodi, imprisoning the very few who had refused to leave. They cut down all the vines and the trees and then set fire to the houses, destroying also most of the dogs. These are not things that an emperor can tolerate, hence Frederick once again went down into Italy, with a great army made up of men from Burgundy, Lorraine, Bohemia, Hungary, Swabia, France, and any other imaginable place. First of all, he founded a new Lodi at Montegazzone, then he encamped before Milan, enthusiastically supported by the people of Pavia and Cremona, Pisa, Lucca, Florence and Siena, Vicenza, Treviso, Padua, Ferrara, Ravenna, Modena, and more, all allied with the empire to humiliate Milan. And Milan was truly humiliated. By the end of the summer the city had capitulated and, in an effort to save it, the Milanese subjected themselves to a ritual that humiliated Buandulino himself, though he had no feelings for Milan. The defeated passed in a sad procession, all barefoot and in sackcloth, including the bishop, with the men-at-arms wearing their swords hung around their neck. Frederick, at this point his magnanimity returning, gave the humiliated the kiss of peace. Was it worth it, Buandulino asked himself, to act so overbearing with Lodi, and then have to humble themselves like this? Is it worth living in these lands where everyone seems to have made a vow of suicide, and one side helps the other kill themselves? I want to leave. In reality, he also wanted to get away from Beatrice, because finally he had read somewhere that distance can cure the love illness, and he had not yet read other books where, on the contrary, it is said that distance is precisely that which fans the flames of passion. So he went to Frederick to remind him of Otto's advice and to have himself sent to Paris. He found the emperor sad and wrathful, pacing back and forth in his chamber, while in one corner Reinald of Dassel was waiting for him to calm down. At a certain point Frederick stood still, looked into Buandulino's eyes, and said, "You are my witness, boy, that I am bending every effort to bring all the cities of Italy under a single law, but, every time, I have to start over again from the beginning. Is my law perhaps wrong? Who can tell me my law is right?" And, as if instinctively, Buandulino said, "Sire, if you start thinking that way, you'll never reach an end, whereas, on the contrary, the emperor exists for this very reason. He isn't emperor because he has the right ideas, but his ideas are right because they come to him, and that's that." Frederick looked at him, then said to Reinald, "This boy expresses things better than the whole pack of you." If these words were simply turned into good Latin, they would seem wondrous. Quod principi placet legis habet vigorum. That which pleases the prince has the strength of law, Reinald of Dassel said. Yes, it sounds very wise and definitive. But it would have to be written in the gospel, otherwise how could all be persuaded to accept this beautiful idea? We clearly saw what happened in Rome, Frederick said. If I have myself anointed by the Pope, I admit ipso facto that his power is superior to mine. If I grab the Pope by the throat and fling him into the Tiber, I become a scourge of God worse even than poor Attila. Where the devil can I find someone who will define my rights without claiming to be above me? Such a person doesn't exist in the world. Perhaps a power such as that doesn't exist, Buandulino then said to him, but the knowledge exists. What do you mean? When Bishop Otto told me what a studium is, he said that these communities of masters and students operate independently. The students come from all over the world and it doesn't matter who their sovereign is, and they pay their teachers, who are therefore dependent entirely on their pupils. This is how things work with the masters of law in Bologna, and this is how it is also in Paris, where in earlier times the masters taught in the cathedral schools and hence were dependent on the bishop, until one fine day they went off to teach on the mountain of St. Genevieve, and they attempt to discover the truth without listening either to the bishop or to the king. If I were their king I'd show them a thing or two. But even if this were the case? It would be the case if you made a law by which you acknowledge that the masters of Bologna are truly independent of every other power, whether yours or the Pope's or any other sovereigns, and they are in the service only of the law. Once they are invested with this dignity, unique in the world, they will affirm that, in accord with true reason, natural enlightenment, and tradition, the only law is the Roman and the only person representing it is the Holy Roman Emperor, and that naturally, as Master Reinald has said so well, quod principi placet legis habet vigorum. And why would they say that? Because, in exchange, you give them the right to say it, and that is no small thing. So you are content, they are content, and, as my father Gagliardo used to say, you are both in an ironclad barrel. They wouldn't agree to anything like that, Reinald grumbled. Yes, they would. Frederick's face brightened. I tell you they will agree. Only, first, they have to make that declaration, and then I'll give them independence. Otherwise everyone will think that they did it to repay a gift from me. If you ask me, even if you do turn the process around, if someone wants to say it was prearranged, they'll say so anyway, Buandulino remarked skeptically. But I'd like to see anyone stand up and say the doctors of Bologna aren't worth a dried fig, when even the emperor has gone humbly to ask their opinion. At that point, what they have said is gospel. And so it happened, that same year, at Roncaglia, where for the second time a great diet was held. For Buandulino it was above all a great spectacle. As Rehuin explained to him, so he wouldn't believe that everything he saw was simply a big circus with banners flapping on all sides, standards, colored tents, merchants, and mountebanks. Frederick, along one side of the Po, had a typical Roman camp reconstructed, to remind everyone that his dignity derived from Rome. In the center of the camp stood the imperial tent, like a temple, and it was encircled by the tents of feudal lords, vassals, and vavassors. On Frederick's side were the Archbishop of Cologne, the Bishop of Bamberg, Daniel of Prague, Conrad of Augusta, and many others. On the other side of the river, the Cardinal Legate of the Apostolic See, the Patriarch of Aquileia, the Archbishop of Milan, the Bishops of Turin, Alba, Ivry, Asti, Novara, Vercelli, Terdona, Pavia, Como, Lodi, Cremona, Piacenza, Reggio, Modena, Bologna, and others, more than can be remembered. Seated in this majestic and truly universal assembly, Frederick opened the discussion. In brief, Buandulino said, so as not to bore Nikitas with the masterpieces of imperial, judicial, and ecclesiastical oratory, 4 doctors of Bologna, the most famous, pupils of the greater Nereus, were invited by the emperor to express an unchallengeable doctrinal opinion on his powers. And 3 of them, Bulgarus, Jacobus, and Hugo of Porta Ravenna, expressed themselves as Frederick wished, namely, that the right of the emperor was based on Roman law. Only a certain Martinus was of a different opinion. And Frederick had then to gouge out his eyes, Nikitas commented. Oh, not at all, Master Nikitas, Buandulino replied. You Rami gouge out the eyes of this man or that and you have no idea where the law stands anymore, forgetting your great Justinian. Immediately afterwards, Frederick promulgated the Constitutio Habita, with which the autonomy of the Bologna Studium was recognized, and if the Studium was autonomous, then Martinus could say what he wanted and not even the emperor could touch a hair of his head. For if he had, then the doctors were no longer autonomous, and if they weren't autonomous then their opinion was worthless, and Frederick risked passing for a usurper. All right, Nikitas thought. Then Master Buandulino wants to suggest to me that he was the founder of the empire, and that if he simply uttered an ordinary sentence, such was his power that it became truth. Let's hear the rest. Meanwhile the Genoese had come in bearing a basket of fruit, because it was midday, and Nikitas had to have refreshment. They said the sack was continuing, and it was best to remain in the house. Buandulino resumed his story. Frederick had decided that, if a boy still almost beardless produced such acute ideas, who could say what would happen if the boy were actually sent to study in Paris? He embraced Buandulino affectionately, urging him to become truly learned, since he himself, with his duties of government and his military operations, had never had time to cultivate his mind properly. The empress had taken her leave of him with a kiss on the forehead. We can only imagine Buandulino's ecstasy, saying to him, that prodigious woman, though she was a great lady and a queen, knew how to read and write. Write to me, tell me about yourself, about what happens to you. Life at court is monotonous. Your letters will be a comfort to me. I will write, I swear, Buandulino said, with an ardor that should have aroused the suspicions of those present. None of them became suspicious. Who notices the excitement of a boy about to go to Paris, except perhaps Beatrice? In fact, she looked at him as if she were seeing him for the first time, and her very white face was covered with an immediate flush. But Buandulino, with a bow that obliged him to look at the ground, had already left the hall. 6. Buandulino goes to Paris. Buandulino arrived in Paris a bit late. In those schools, students entered before they were 14, and he was 2 years older. But he had already learned so many things from Otto that he allowed himself to miss some of the lessons in order, as will be seen, to do other things. He had set off with a companion, the son of a knight from Cologne, who preferred to devote himself to the liberal arts rather than to the army, not without causing his father some pain, but supported by his mother, who vaunted his precocious poetic gifts, whence Buandulino, if he had ever known the youth's name, soon forgot it. He called him the poet, and so did all the others who met him later. Buandulino soon discovered that the poet had never written a poem, but had only declared his wish to write some. Since he constantly recited the poems of others, in the end even his father became convinced that his son should follow the muses and allowed him to leave, putting in his pocket barely enough to keep him alive, in the completely mistaken notion that the small amount necessary to live in Cologne would be more than enough for life in Paris. Immediately upon his arrival, Buandulino, who could hardly wait to obey the empress, wrote her some letters. In the beginning he believed he would allay his ardor by fulfilling that request, but he realized how painful it was to write without being able to tell her what he truly felt, inditing letters perfect and seemly, in which he described Paris, a city rich in beautiful churches, where one breathed fine air, the sky was vast and serene, except when it rained, but never more than once or twice a day, and for someone who came from virtually eternal fog, it was a place of eternal spring. There was a winding river with 2 islands in the middle, and the water was very good to drink, and just beyond the walls balmy spaces stretched away, such as the meadow next to the Abbey of Saint-Germain, where they spent beautiful afternoons playing ball. He told her of his troubles in the early days, when he had to find a room to share with his companion, without letting the landlords cheat him. At a dear price they had found a fairly spacious room, with a table, 2 benches, shelves for books and a trunk. There was a high bed with an ostrich feather comforter, and a low bed on wheels with a goose down cover, which in the daytime was concealed beneath the bigger one. The letter did not say that, after a brief hesitation over the assignment of the beds, it was decided that every evening the 2 roommates would play chess for the more comfortable bed, because a court chess was considered an unseemly game. Another letter told how they awoke early because lessons began at 7 and lasted until late afternoon. They fortified themselves with a good ration of bread and a bowl of wine, before going to listen to their masters, teachers in a kind of stable, where, seated on the sparse straw on the ground, they were colder than they would have been outside. Beatrice was moved and urged him not to be frugal with the wine, otherwise a youth feels listless the whole day, and to hire a servant, not only to carry the books, which are very heavy and to carry them oneself is unworthy of a person of rank, but also to buy the wood and light the fire in the room betimes, so that it would be good and warm in the evening. And for all these expenses she sent 40 solidi of Susa, enough to buy an ox. The servant had not been hired and the wood had not been bought, because at night the 2 featherbeds were fine. The sum had been spent more wisely, inasmuch as the evenings were passed in taverns, which were splendidly heated and permitted some refreshment after a day of study, and some pinching of bottoms of the serving wenches. And further, in those places of merry repose, like the Écu d'Argent, the Croix de Fer, les trois chandeliers. Between one mug and the next, they restored their vigor with pork or chicken pies, a pair of pigeons or a roast goose, or, if they were poorer, with tripe or mutton. Buandulino helped the poet, who was penniless, to live not by tripe alone. But the poet was a costly friend, because the amount of wine he drank made that Susa ox grow thinner before their very eyes. Omitting these details, Buandulino went on to write of his masters and the fine things he was learning. Beatrice was very sensitive to these revelations, which whetted her own appetite for knowledge, and she read and reread the letters in which Buandulino told her about grammar, dialectics, rhetoric, and of arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. But Buandulino felt more and more cowardly, because, writing to her, he remained silent about what most oppressed his heart and about all the other things he did, which cannot be told to a mother or to a sister, or to an empress, or, still less, to the beloved woman. Mostly the students played ball, true, but they also brawled with the people of the Abbey of Saint-Germain, or among students of different origin, Picards against Normans, for example, and they traded insults in Latin, so that anyone could understand you were offending him. These were all things frowned upon by the great provost, who sent his bowmen to arrest the most unruly. Obviously, at this point the students forgot their differences and altogether fell to exchanging blows with the bowmen. No men in the world were more easily corrupted than the bowmen of the provost. So if a student was arrested, they all had to dig into their purses to persuade the bowmen to set him free. This made the pleasures of Paris even more costly. Second, a student who has no amorous affairs is derided by his fellows. Unfortunately, the most inaccessible thing for the students was women. There were very few female students to be seen, and there were legends still circulated about the beautiful Eloise, who had cost her lover the cutting off of his pudenda, even if it was one thing to be a student, hence by definition ill-famed and yet tolerated, and another to be a professor, like the great and unhappy Abelard. Mercenary love was expensive, and so they had to rely on the occasional tavern wench or some common woman of the neighborhood, but in that quarter there were always more students than females. Unless they managed to assume an idle air and ribald look while strolling on the Ile de la Cité, and thus succeed in seducing ladies of higher station. Much desired were the wives of the butchers of La Grève, who, after an honored career in their trade, no longer slaughtered cattle but governed the meat market, behaving like gentlemen. With a husband born quartering oxen, who had achieved comfort late in life, the wives were lured to the fascination of the more handsome students. But these ladies wore sumptuous dresses decorated with fur and silver and bejeweled belts, which made it difficult at first sight to distinguish them from grand prostitutes who, though the laws forbade it, usually dressed in the same fashion. This exposed the students to some unfortunate misunderstandings, for which they were all the more derided by their friends. If a student succeeded in winning a real lady, or indeed a virtuous maiden, sooner or later husbands and fathers would find out, and there would be a fight, sometimes with weapons. And someone died or was wounded, almost always the husband or father, and then there was more brawling with the bowmen of the provost. Buandulino hadn't killed anyone, and in general he also stayed well away from brawls, but with one husband, and butcher, he had to deal. Ardent in love but cautious in matters of war, when he saw the husband enter the room, swinging one of those hooks used to hang slaughtered animals, Buandulino immediately tried to jump out the window. But, as he was judiciously calculating the distance before making the leap, he had time to receive a slash on the cheek, thus decorating forever his face with a scar worthy of a man-at-arms. On the other hand, even winning working-class women was not an everyday occurrence and demanded long sieges at the expense of lessons, and whole days spent observing from the window, which generated boredom. Then dreams of seduction were abandoned, and the youths threw water down on the passers-by, or they used the women as targets, firing peas with a slingshot, or they even taunted teachers who went past below, and if these grew angry, the students would follow them, in a body, to their house, throwing stones at the windows because, after all, it was the students who paid them and thus had earned some rights. Buandulino, in fact, was telling Nikitas what he had not told Beatrice, namely, that he was becoming one of those clerics who studied the liberal arts in Paris, or jurisprudence in Bologna, or medicine in Salerno, or sorcery in Toledo, but in no place learned good behavior. Nikitas did not know whether to be shocked, amazed, or amused. In Byzantium there were only private schools for the sons of well-to-do families, where, from their earliest years, they learned grammar and read pious works and the masterpieces of classical culture. After the age of 11 they studied poetry and rhetoric, they learned to compose on the literary models of the ancients, and the rarer the terms they used, and the more complex their syntactical constructions, the more readily they were considered for a bright future in the imperial administration. But afterwards, either they became sages in a monastery or they studied things such as law or astronomy from private masters. Still, they studied seriously, whereas it seemed that in Paris the students did everything except study. Buandulino corrected him. In Paris we worked very hard. For example, after the first years, we were already taking part in debates, and in debate you learn to posit objections and to move on to the determination, that is, to the final solution of a question. And you mustn't think that the lessons are the most important things for a student, or that the tavern is only a place where they waste time. The good thing about the studium is that you learn from your teachers, true, but even more from your fellows, especially those older than you, when they tell you what they have read, and you discover that the world must be full of wondrous things and to know them all, since a lifetime will not be enough for you to travel through the whole world. You can only read all the books. Baudolino had been able to read many books with Otto, but he hadn't realized that there could exist as many in the world as there were in Paris. They were not at everyone's disposal, but through good luck, or rather, through good attendance at his lessons, he had come to know Abdul. To explain the connection between Abdul and the libraries, I have to go back a little, Master Nikitas. While I was following a lesson, always blowing on my fingers to warm them, and with my bottom freezing, because the straw didn't offer much protection against that floor, icy like all of Paris on those winter days, one morning I noticed a boy near me who, by the color of his face, seemed a Saracen, except that he also had red hair, which you don't find among Moors. I don't know if he was following the lesson or pursuing his own thoughts, but he was staring into space. Every so often he would shiver and pull his clothing around him, then he would return to looking into the air, and at times he would scratch something on his tablet. I craned my neck, and I realized that half of what he wrote looked like those fly droppings that are the Arab's alphabet, and for the rest he wrote in a language that seemed Latin but wasn't, and it even reminded me of the dialects of my land. Anyway, when the lesson was over, I struck up a conversation. He reacted politely, as if he had been wanting for some time to find a person to talk with. We made friends, we went walking along the river, and he told me his story. Asterisk. The boy's name was Abdul, a Moor's name, in fact, but he was born of a mother who came from Hibernia, and this explained the red hair, because all those who come from that remote island are like that, and according to report, they're bizarre, dreamers. His father was Provençal, of a family that had settled overseas after the conquest of Jerusalem, 50-some years before. As Abdul tried to explain, those Frankish nobles had adopted the customs of the peoples they had conquered. They wore turbans and indulged in other trickeries, they spoke the language of their enemies, and were within an inch of following the precepts of the Koran. For which reason a half-Hibernian, with red hair, could be called Abdul and could have a face burned by the sun of Syria, where he was born. He thought in Arabic, and in Provençal he told the ancient sagas of the frozen seas of the north, which he had heard from his mother. Baudolino immediately asked him if he was in Paris to become a good Christian again and speak as one should, namely, in proper Latin. As to his reasons for coming to Paris, Abdul remained fairly reticent. He spoke of a thing that had happened to him, something fairly upsetting apparently, a kind of terrible ordeal to which he had been subjected while still a boy, so that his noble parents had decided to send him to Paris to save him from some unknown vendetta. Speaking of this, Abdul turned grim, blushing as much as a Moor can blush, his hands trembling, and Baudolino decided to change the subject. The youth was intelligent, and after a few months in Paris he spoke Latin in the local vernacular. He lived with an uncle, canon of the Abbey of Saint Victoire, one of the sanctuaries of learning of that city, and perhaps of the whole Christian world, with a library richer than that of Alexandria. And that explains how, in the months that followed, thanks to Abdul, Baudolino and also the poet gained access to that repository of universal learning. Baudolino asked Abdul what he was writing during the lesson, and his companion said that the notes in Arabic concerned certain things that the teacher said about dialectics, because Arabic is surely the language best suited to philosophy. As for the other things, they were in Provençal. He was reluctant to speak of it and evaded the questions for a long time, but with the air of one who with his eyes asks only to be questioned further, and finally he translated. They were some verses, and they said more or less, "O my love, in your distant land, my heart aches for you. O my flowered curtain, O my unknown, O my companion." You write verses? Baudolino asked. I sing songs. I sing what I feel. I love a distant princess. A princess? Who is she? I don't know. I saw her, or rather it's as if I saw her, in the Holy Land when I was a prisoner. In other words, while I was experiencing an adventure I haven't yet told you about. My heart burst into flame, and I vowed eternal love to that lady. I decided to dedicate my life to her. Perhaps one day I will find her, but I fear it's happening. It is so beautiful to languish for an impossible love. Baudolino was about to say to him, "Some fool you are," as his father used to say, but then he remembered that he too languished for an impossible love, even if he had undoubtedly seen Beatrice, and her image was the obsession of his nights, and he was touched by the fate of his friend Abdul. This is how a great friendship begins. That same evening Abdul turned up at the room of Baudolino and the poet, with an instrument that Baudolino had never seen, shaped like an almond, with many taut strings, and letting his fingers stray over those strings, Abdul sang. When the flow of the fountain runs clear and, as always, the dog rose blossoms, and the nightingale on the bough sings its soft and varied song, and refines its sweet singing, my song accompanies it. Oh, my love in your distant land, my heart aches for you, nor will I find medicine if I do not answer your summons. In the warmth of your wool, oh my flowered curtain, oh my unknown, oh my companion, I cannot have you near. And in the fire I burn and yearn. Never have I seen a Christian maid who existed, God willing, nor Jew, nor Saracen maid, superior to your beauty, who wins your love, at evening and at morn. Oh my love, I call you. My mind turns insane. My yearning clouds the sun. Already, as if by a thorn, I am stung. By that pain that heals me. And a tear bathes me. The melody was sweet, the chords awoke unknown or dormant passions, and Baudolino thought of Beatrice. Dear Christ, the poet said, why can't I write verses that beautiful? I don't want to become a poet. I sing for myself, nothing else. If you like, I will give them to you. Abdul said, also touched now. Oh, yes, the poet replied, but if I translate them from Provençal into German, they turn to shit. Abdul became the third member of that band, and when Buandulino tried not to think of Beatrice, that damned Moor with the red hair would take his accursed instrument and sing songs that made Buandulino's heart ache. If the nightingale amid the leaves bestows love and demands it, and his companion replies, and already mingles her song with his, and the rivulet from the brook, with the happiness of the meadow, feels joy in its heart, in friendship melts my soul, and greater benefice does not claim than the love that she returns, and that is promptly perceived in my ailing heart, sick with aching savor. Buandulino told himself that one day he too would write songs for his faraway empress, but he did not clearly know how it was done, because neither Otto nor Rehuin had ever mentioned poetry to him, unless it was when they taught him some sacred anthem. For now at least he took advantage of Abdul to gain access to the library of Saint Victoire, where he spent long mornings stolen from his lessons, pondering, his lips parted, over the fabulous texts, not the manuals of grammar, but the stories of Pliny, the romance of Alexander, the geography of Solinus, and the etymologies of Isidore. He read of distant lands, where crocodiles live, great aquatic serpents that, when they have eaten a man, weep, move their upper jaw and have no tongue. The hippopotami, half man and half horse. The leucocrocan beast, with the body of an ass, the behind of a stag, the breast and thighs of a lion, horse's hoofs, a bifurcated horn, a mouth stretching to the ears from which an almost human voice emerges, and in the place of teeth, a single bone. He read of lands where there lived men without knee joints, men without tongues, men with huge ears that sheltered their body from the cold, and the sciapods, who run very swiftly on a single foot. Since he could not send Beatrice songs not of his own composition, and even if he had written some, he would not have dared, he decided that, as one sends his beloved flowers or jewels, he would make her a gift of all the wonders that he was acquiring. So he wrote her of lands where honey trees and flower trees grow, of Mount Ararat, from whose peak, on clear days, you can glimpse the remains of Noah's Ark, and those who have scaled it say they touch with their finger the hole through which the devil escaped when Noah recited the Benedicite. He told her of Albania, where men are whiter than elsewhere, and have hair sparse as a cat's whiskers. Of a country where if one turns to the east he casts his shadow to his own right, and of another inhabited by people of the greatest ferocity, who go into deepest mourning when children are born, but hold a great festivity when people die. Of lands where enormous mountains of gold rise, guarded by ants the size of dogs, and where the Amazons live, warrior women who keep their men in a neighboring region. If they bear a son they send him to his father or else they kill him. If they bear a female they remove her breast with a searing iron. If she is of high rank, they remove the left breast so that she can carry a shield, if of low degree, the right breast so that she can draw a. He told her of Albania, where men are whiter than elsewhere, and have hair sparse as a cat's whiskers. Of a country where if one turns to the east he casts his shadow to his own right, and of another inhabited by people of the greatest ferocity, who go into deepest mourning when children are born, but hold a great festivity when people die. Of lands where enormous mountains of gold rise, guarded by ants the size of dogs, and where the Amazons live, warrior women who keep their men in a neighboring region. If they bear a son they send him to his father or else they kill him. If they bear a female they remove her breast with a searing iron. If she is of high rank, they remove the left breast so that she can carry a shield, if of low degree, the right breast so that she can draw a bow. The greatest ferocity, who go into deepest mourning when children are born, but hold a great festivity when people die. Of lands where enormous mountains of gold rise, guarded by ants the size of dogs, and where the Amazons live, warrior women who keep their men in a neighboring region. If they bear a son they send him to his father or else they kill him. If they bear a female they remove her breast with a searing iron. If she is of high rank, they remove the left breast so that she can carry a shield, if of low degree, the right breast so that she can draw a bow. And finally he told her of the Nile, one of the 4 rivers springing from the earthly paradise, which runs through the deserts of India, goes underground, emerges near Mount Atlas, then empties into the sea after crossing Egypt. But when he came to India, Buandulino almost forgot Beatrice, and his mind turned to other fancies, because he had got it into his head that in those parts there had to be, if there ever had been, the kingdom of that presbyter Johannes of whom Otto had told him. Buandulino had never ceased to think of Johannes. He thought of him every time he read about an unknown country, and even more when on the parchment varicolored miniatures appeared of strange beings, like horned men or pygmies, who spend their lives fighting cranes. He thought of this so much that, to himself, he now spoke of Prester John as if he were a family friend. And hence to discover where he was became for Buandulino a matter of the greatest moment, and, if Johannes was nowhere, still in India had to be found where he could be placed, because Buandulino felt bound by an oath, though none had been sworn, to the beloved dying bishop. Of Prester John he had spoken to his 2 companions, who were immediately attracted by the game and communicated to Buandulino any vague and curious information they found, leafing through codices, that might waft an aroma of India's incenses. Abdul suddenly had the idea that his distant princess, if she had to be distant, should conceal her splendor in that most distant land of all. Yes, Buandulino replied, but where do you go to reach India? It shouldn't be far from the earthly paradise, and thus east of the Orient, just where the land ends and the ocean begins. They had not yet begun the course of lessons in astronomy, and on the question of the Earth's shape their ideas were hazy. The poet was still convinced that it was a long, flat expanse, at the ends of which the waters of the ocean poured down, God knows where. To Buandulino, on the contrary, Rehuin had said, though with some skepticism, that not only the great philosophers of antiquity, or Ptolemy, father of all astronomers, but also Saint Isidore had asserted that the Earth was a sphere. Indeed, Isidore had such Christian assurance of this that he had even established the breadth at the equator, 80,000 stadia. However, Rehuin cautiously added that it was equally true that certain fathers, like the great Lactantius, had recalled that according to the Bible the Earth had the shape of a tabernacle, and therefore land and sky together should be seen as an ark, a temple with its fine dome and its floor, a large box, in other words, not a ball. Prudent man that he was, Rehuin held to what St. Augustine had said, that maybe the pagan philosophers were right and the Earth was round, and the Bible had mentioned tabernacle in a figurative sense, but the fact of knowing how it was shaped did not help resolve the one serious problem of every good Christian, namely, how to save one's soul, and therefore devoting even just a half-hour to ponder the shape of the Earth was a total waste of time. That seems right to me, said the poet, who was in a hurry to go to the tavern, and it's useless to seek the earthly paradise, because it must have been a marvel of hanging gardens, and it has remained uninhabited since the time of Adam. Nobody has taken the trouble to reinforce the terraces with hedges and palisades, and during the flood it must all have slid down into the ocean. Abdul, on the contrary, was absolutely certain that the Earth was a sphere. If it were just a flat expanse, he argued with undoubting severity, my gaze, which my love makes very acute, like that of all lovers, would be able to glimpse far, far away, some sign of the presence of my beloved, but instead the curve of the earth conceals her from my desire. And he ransacked the library of Saint Victoire to find maps that he then reconstructed summarily, from memory, for his friends. The earth is in the center of the great chain of the ocean, and it is divided by three great bodies of water, the Hellespont, the Mediterranean, and the Nile. Just a moment. Where's the Orient? Up here, naturally, where there's Asia, and at the far end of the Orient, just where the sun rises, is the earthly paradise. To the left of paradise there's Mount Caucasus, and nearby the Caspian Sea. Now bear in mind, there are three Indias, an India Major, which is very hot, just to the right of paradise. A northern India, beyond the Caspian Sea, another here, in the upper left, where it is so cold that the water turns to crystal, and where there are the peoples of Gog and Magog, whom Alexander the Great imprisoned inside a wall, and finally a temperate India, close to Africa. And Africa you see in the lower right-hand corner, where the Nile flows, and where the Arabian Sea opens in the Persian Gulf, just on the Red Sea, beyond which there is desert land, very close to the sun of the equator and so hot that no one can venture there. To the west of Africa, near Mauritania, are the Isles of the Blessed or the Lost Isle, which was discovered many centuries ago by a saint from my country. Below, to the north, is the land where we live, with Constantinople on the Hellespont, and Greece, and Rome, and in the extreme north the Germanians and the Hibernian island. But how can you take such a map seriously, the poet snickered, when it shows the earth flat, and you claim it's a sphere? What kind of argument is that? Abdul was indignant. Could you depict a sphere in such a way that you could see everything on it? A map must serve to point out the way, and when you walk, you see the earth flat, not round. Besides, even if it's a sphere, all the part underneath is uninhabited, and occupied by the ocean, for if anybody were to live there he'd be living with his feet up and his head down. So to depict the upper part, a circle like this is enough. But I want to examine better the maps of the abbey, also because in the library I met a cleric who knows everything about the earthly paradise. Of course, he was there when Eve was giving the apple to Adam, the poet said. You don't have to be in a place in order to know everything about it, Abdul replied. Otherwise sailors would be more learned than theologians. This, Buandulino explained to Nikitas, showed how, ever since their first years in Paris, when they were still almost beardless, our friends had begun to be gripped by this story, which so many years later would take them to the far ends of the earth. 7. Buandulino makes the poet write love letters and poems to Beatrice. In the spring, Buandulino discovered that his love was growing greater and greater, as happens to lovers in that season, and it was not allayed by the squalid encounters with maids of no importance. Indeed, in comparison it grew gigantic, because Beatrice, besides the advantages of grace, intelligence, and royal anointment, had also the advantage of absence. The fascination of absence was a question with which Abdul never ceased tormenting him, spending whole evenings stroking his instrument and singing more songs, until, fully to appreciate them, Buandulino had by now also learned Provençal. And when the days are long in May, how sweet to hear the distant birdsong. Because, since this journey first began, I recall forever that distant love. In my pain I bow my head. Nor does song ease me more, and the hawthorn. Buandulino dreamed. Abdul despairs of seeing one day his unknown princess, he said to himself, oh happy he. Worse is my suffering, for surely I will have to see my beloved again one of these days, and I haven't the good fortune never to have seen her, but rather the misfortune of knowing who and what she is. But if Abdul finds consolation in telling his grief to us, why should I not find the same in telling my life to her? In other words, Buandulino sensed that he could discipline the throbbing of his heart by writing down on paper what he felt, and so much the worse if the object of his love would be deprived of these treasures of tenderness. So, late in the night, while the poet was sleeping, Buandulino wrote. The star illuminates the pole, and the moon colors the night. But my guide is a sole star, and if, when the shadows have been dispelled, my star rises from the east, my mind will ignore the shadows of sorrow. You are my radiant star, who will dispel the night, and light itself without you as night, whereas with you night is splendid radiance. And he went on. If I feel hunger, only you sat me. If I feel thirst, only you quench it. But what am I saying? You refresh, but do not satiate. Never have I been sated with you, nor shall I ever be. And then, so great is your sweetness, so wondrous your constancy, so ineffable the tone of your voice, such the beauty and the grace that crown you, that it would be a great offense to attempt to express them in words. May the fire that consumes us grow always, and with new fuel, and the more it remains hidden, the more it will flare up and deceive the envious and the treacherous, so that the question will ever remain. Which of us two loves the more, and so between us there will always be joined a beautiful duel in which both are victorious. The letters were beautiful, and rereading them, Buandulino trembled, and was ever more enchanted by a creature capable of inspiring such ardor. At a certain point he could no longer accept not knowing how Beatrice would have reacted to such sweet violence, and he decided to impel her to reply. Trying to imitate her hand, he wrote, "To the love that rises from the heart of my heart, that is more sweetly fragrant than any perfume, she who is yours body and soul, for the thirsting flowers of your youth, wishes the freshness of an eternal happiness. To you, my happy hope, I offer my faith, and with all devotion I offer myself, for as long as I may live." Oh, he immediately replied to her, "Be well, for in you lies all my health, in you are my hope and my repose. Even before I am fully awake, my soul finds you again, preserved within itself." And she answered, boldly, "From that first moment when we saw each other, I have loved you before all others. Preferring you, I have wanted you. Wanting you, I have sought you. Seeking you, I have found you. Finding you, I have loved you. Loving you, I have desired you. Desiring you, I have set you in my heart above all else. And I have savored your honey. I greet you, my heart, my body, my only joy." This correspondence, which lasted for some months, gave, first, refreshment to Buandulino's exacerbated soul, then a replete happiness, and finally a kind of blazing pride, because the lover had not realized how the beloved could love him so much. Like all those in love, Buandulino became vain. Like all those in love, he wrote that he wanted to enjoy jealously with his beloved their shared secret, but at the same time he insisted that the whole world be informed of his joy, and be stunned by the immeasurable loving nature of the woman who loved him. So one day he showed the correspondence to his friends. He was vague and reticent about the manner and identity of this exchange. He did not lie. Indeed, he said he was showing those letters precisely because they were the fruit of his imagination. But the other two believed that, only and precisely in this instance, he was lying, and they envied his lot all the more. In his heart Abdul attributed the letters to his princess, and he agonized as if he had received them himself. The poet, who made a show of attaching no importance to this literary game, though it gnawed at his heart that he himself had not written such beautiful letters, provoking replies even more beautiful, and having no one with whom to fall in love, had fallen in love with the letters themselves, which, as Nikitas remarked with a smile, was not surprising, since in youth we are prone to fall in love with love. Perhaps to find new themes for his songs, Abdul jealously copied the letters, to reread them at night in Saint Victoire. Then one day he realized that someone had stolen them from him, and he feared that by now some dissolute canon, after having lubriciously spelled them out at night, had thrown them among the 1,000 manuscripts of the abbey. Shuddering, Buandulino locked his correspondence in his trunk, and from that day on he wrote no further missives, so as not to compromise his correspondent. Having, in any case, to release his adolescent fervor, Buandulino then took to writing verses. While in the letters he had spoken of his holy pure love, in these new writings he practiced the tavern poetry with which the clerics of the period vaunted their dissolute and carefree life, not without some melancholy reference to their wasting of it. Wishing to give Nikitas evidence of his talent, he recited a few hemistichs. Furor ego voluti, sine nauda navis, ut per vias eris, vega fertor avis, quidquid Venus imperit, labor est suavis, quae nunquam in cordibus, habitat ignavus. Realizing that Nikitas did not clearly understand the Latin, he made a rough translation. I am derelict like a ship without a helmsman, like a bird along the pathways of the sky. But what pleasant toil it is to obey the commands of Venus, unknown to common souls. Buandulino showed these and other verses to the poet, who flushed with envy and shame, and wept, confessing the aridity that dried up his imagination, cursing his impotence, shouting that he would have preferred not to know how to penetrate a woman than to find himself so incapable of expressing what he felt inside, and that it was exactly what Buandulino had expressed so well, making the poet wonder if his friend had not read his heart. Then he observed how proud his father would be if he were able to compose such beautiful verses, for one day or another he would have to justify to his family and to the world the acquired nickname of poet, which, while it flattered him, made him feel a poeta gloriosus, a braggart, who steals a dignity that is not his. Seeing him in such despair, Buandulino pressed the parchment between the youth's hands, offering him the poems so he could display them as his own. A precious gift, because it so happened that Buandulino, to have something new to tell Beatrice, had actually sent her the verses, attributing them to his friend. Beatrice had read them to Frederick. Reynald of Dassel, a lover of literature, though always taken up with palace intrigues, heard them and said he would like to have the poet in his service. In that same year Reynaud was raised to the lofty office of Archbishop of Cologne, and to the poet the notion of becoming official poet to an archbishop, and thus, as he put it, half joking and half swaggering, the archpoet, did not displease him, not least because he had very little desire to study. The paternal funds in Paris never sufficed, and he had got the idea, not mistaken, that a court poet ate and drank all day long without a thought for anything else. But to be a court poet you have to write poems. Buandulino promised to write at least a dozen for him, but not all at once. You see, he said, great poets are not always diaroic, sometimes they're styptic, and those are the greater ones. You must seem tormented by the muses, able to distill only one couplet every now and then. With the ones I'll give you, you can keep going for quite a few months, but allow me some time, because while I'm not styptic, I'm not diaroic either. So postpone your departure and send a few verses to Reynaud, to whet his appetite. For the present it's a good idea for you to introduce yourself with a dedication, a eulogy of your benefactor. He thought about it all one night, then gave the poet some verses for Reynaud. Praesul disgradissime, veniam te precor. Morte bona morior, dulci nis necor. Meum pectum sauciat, puellarum decor. Et quas tacto neceo, saltum cord mecor. Which is to say, most noble bishop, forgive me, for I face a happy death and am consumed by such a sweet wound. Maiden's beauty pierces my heart, and those whom I cannot touch, I possess at least in my thoughts. Nikitas remarked that Latin bishops found pleasure in things that were not very holy, but Buandulino told him that he should first understand what a Latin bishop was. It was not required that he necessarily be a sainted man, especially if he was also chancellor of the empire. And second, who Reynaud was. A little bit bishop and very much chancellor, certainly a lover of poetry, but still more inclined to use a poet's talents also for his own political ends, as he would subsequently do. And so the poet became famous thanks to your verses. That's right. For almost a year the poet sent Reynaud letters overflowing with devotion, accompanying verses that I wrote for him from time to time. Finally Reynaud insisted that this unusual talent should join him at any price. The poet set off with a good provision of verses, enough to supply him for at least a year, however styptic he might seem. It was a triumph. I've never understood how anyone can be proud of a fame received as alms from another, but the poet was content. Speaking of amazement, I ask myself what pleasure you can have felt, seeing your creations attributed to someone else. Isn't it atrocious that a father should give away, as alms, the fruit of his loins? The fate of a tavern poem is to pass from one mouth to another, it is happiness to hear it sung, and it would be egoism to want to exhibit it only to increase one's own glory. I don't believe you're that humble. You are happy to have been once again the prince of falsehood, and you flaunt it, just as you hope that one day someone will find your love letters among the jumble of papers in Saint Victoire and attribute them to God knows whom. I don't mean to seem humble. I like making things happen, and to be the only one who knows they're my doing. The question doesn't change, my friend, Nikitas said. Indulgently, I suggested you wanted to be the prince of falsehood, and now you make me realize you would like to be God Almighty. 8. Buandulino in the earthly paradise. Buandulino was studying in Paris, but he kept abreast of what was happening in Italy and in Germany. Rehuin, obeying the orders of Otto, had continued writing the Gesta Friederici, but, having now reached the end of the fourth book, he had decided to stop because it seemed to him blasphemous to exceed the number of the Gospels. He left the court, satisfied, his duty done, and was dying of boredom in a Bavarian monastery. Buandulino wrote him of his free access to the endless library of Saint Victoire, and Rehuin asked him to indicate a few rare treatises that could enhance his knowledge. Sharing Otto's opinion of the poor canon's scant imagination, Buandulino considered it useful to nourish it a bit. After sending him a few titles of codices he had seen, he also mentioned others of his own invention, such as De Optimitate Troparum of the Venerable Bede, an Ars Honesty Petandi, a De Modo Cacandi, a De Castramentandis Crinibus, and a De Patria Diabolorum. All works that provoked the amazement and the curiosity of the good canon, who hastened to ask for copies of these unknown treasures of learning. A service that Buandulino would have done him willingly, to heal his remorse for the parchment of Otto that he had scraped, but he simply did not know what to copy, and he had to invent the excuse that those works were, indeed, in the Abbey of Saint Victoire, but were an odor of heresy and the canons would not allow anyone to see them. Then I learned, Buandulino said to Nikitas, that Rehuin had written to a Parisian scholar, begging him to ask the Victorians for those manuscripts, but the scholars obviously found no trace of them. They accused their librarian of negligence, and the poor man had to swear that he had never seen them. I imagine, in the end, some canon, to put matters right, really did compose those texts, and I hope that someday someone will come upon them. Meanwhile, the poet kept him informed of the exploits of Frederick. The Italian communes were not keeping faith with all the oaths they had sworn at the Diet of Roncaglia. According to the pacts, the unruly cities were to demolish their walls and destroy their war machines. But instead the citizens pretended to fill in the moats around the cities, and the moats were still there. Frederick sent envoys to Crema, to enjoin them to act quickly, and the people of Crema threatened to kill the imperial envoys, who would really have been killed if they hadn't run off. Then to Milan they actually sent Reynaud and a Palatine count, to name the Podesta, because the Milanese could not claim to acknowledge the imperial rights and then elect their consuls on their own. And there, too, both envoys nearly lost their skins, and they were no ordinary messengers, but the chancellor of the empire and one of the counts of the palace. Still not content, the Milanese besieged the castle of Trezzo and put the garrison in chains. Finally, they again attacked Lodi, and when they touched Lodi, the emperor flew into a blind rage. And so, to set an example, he laid siege to Crema. In the beginning the siege proceeded according to the rules of a war among Christians. The Cremasks, helped by the Milanese, made some good sorties and captured many imperial prisoners. The Cremonese, who in their hatred of Crema were then siding with the empire, along with Pavia and Lodi, built very powerful war machines, which had cost the life of more besiegers than a besiege, but that is the way things went. There were fine clashes, as the poet recounted with gusto, and everyone recalled how the emperor made the Lodigiani give him 200 empty hogsheads, which were then filled with earth and wood. The Lodigiani had brought in more than 2,000 wagons, so that it was possible to pass with the magli, the so-called cats, to hammer at the walls. But when they attacked with the greatest of the wooden towers, one built by the Cremonese, and the besieged began catapulting so many stones that the tower risked collapse, the emperor lost his head in his great fury. He ordered some Crema and Milanese prisoners brought, and had them bound to the front and sides of the tower. He thought that the besieged, seeing before them their brothers, cousins, sons, and fathers, would not dare shoot. He failed to calculate the great fury of the Cremasks, both those on the walls and those bound outside them. It was the latter who shouted to their brothers not to give in, and those on the walls, clenching their teeth, tears in their eyes, executioners of their own kin, continued assailing the tower, killing 9 of their people. Milanese students arriving in Paris swore to Buandulino that some children had also been tied to the tower, but the poet assured him that the rumor was false. The fact remains that at this point even the emperor was affected, and ordered the other prisoners to be untied. But Cremasks and Milanese, maddened by their comrades' end, brought Lodigiani and Aleman prisoners from the city, placed them on the ramparts, and killed them in cold blood before Frederick's eyes. He then ordered 2 Crema prisoners carried below the walls and, below the walls, he tried them as perjurers and traitors, sentencing them to death. The Crema leaders sent word that if Frederick hanged their men, they would hang any men of his they were still holding hostage. Frederick replied that he would like to see them do that, and he hanged the 2 prisoners. The only reply of the Crema men was to hang coram populo all their hostages. Frederick, who by now had lost the power of reason, had all the Cremaci he still held brought out, ordered a forest of gallows to be raised before the city, and was about to hang them all. Bishops and abbots rushed to the scene of the torture, begging him, who should be the fountainhead of mercy, not to emulate the wickedness of his enemies. Frederick was touched by this intervention, but he could not take back his assertion, hence he decided to execute at least 9 of those unfortunates. Hearing these things, Buandulino wept. He was by nature a man of peace, and the idea that his beloved adoptive father had stained himself with such crimes convinced him to remain in Paris to study and, in a very obscure way, without his realizing it, persuaded him that it was not unlawful to love the empress. He resumed writing letters, more and more impassioned, and replies that would make a hermit yearn. Only now he no longer showed anything to his friends. Still feeling guilty, he resolved to do something for the glory of his master. Otto, as a sacred bequest, had left him the task of bringing Prester John forth from the shadows of heresy. So Buandulino devoted himself to the search for the priest, unknown, and yet, as Otto had testified, surely notorious. Having completed the years of trivium and quadrivium, Buandulino and Abdul had been educated in disputation, so first of all they asked themselves, does a Prester John really exist? But they began asking themselves this question in circumstances that Buandulino was reluctant to explain to Nikitas. After the poet left, Abdul now lived with Buandulino. One evening coming home, he found Abdul alone, singing a beautiful song, in which he dreamed of meeting his distant princess, but as she drew closer, he seemed to be receding. Buandulino wondered whether it was the music or the words, as the image of Beatrice, which had appeared to him with the song, faded from his gaze into the void. Abdul sang, and never had his singing seemed so seductive. The song came to an end. Abdul fell back, exhausted. For a moment Buandulino feared the boy was going to faint. He bent over him, but Abdul raised a hand, as if in reassurance, and laughed softly for no reason. His whole body trembled, as if he had a fever. Still laughing, Abdul asked to be left alone. He would calm down, he knew well what was happening. Pressed by Buandulino's questions, he finally decided to confess his secret. Listen, my friend, I have eaten a little green honey, just a little. I know it's a diabolical temptation, but sometimes I need it, to sing. Listen, and don't reproach me. In early childhood in the Holy Land I heard a marvelous and terrible story. It was said that not far from Antioch there lived a race of Saracens, dwelling among the mountains in a castle that only the eagles could reach. Their lord was named Elodin, and he inspired the greatest fear in the Saracen princes, and in the Christian as well. In fact, in the center of his castle, according to the story, there was a garden full of every kind of fruit and flower, where little canals flowed, filled with wine or milk or honey and water, and all around danced maidens of incomparable beauty. In the garden only certain youths could live, whom Elodin had ordered abducted, and in that place of delights he trained them only to pleasure. And I say pleasure because, as I heard my elders whisper, and, disturbed, I would blush, those maidens were generous and ready to satisfy those guests, procuring them ineffable joys, also debilitating, I imagine. So, naturally, those who entered that place would never want to leave it, not at any price. No fool, you're a Loden, or whatever he was called. Buandulino smiled as he passed a moist cloth over his friend's brow. You think that, Abdul said, because you don't know the whole story. Some fine morning one of these youths woke up in a sordid, sun-filled yard, where he found himself in chains. After a few days of suffering, he was brought into a Loden's presence. He threw himself at the master's feet, threatening suicide and imploring to be restored to the delights without which he could no longer live. Loden then revealed to the youth that he had fallen into disfavor with the prophet and could regain favor only if he declared himself willing to carry out a great mission. Loden gave him a golden dagger and told him to set forth, to journey to the court of a certain lord, Loden's enemy, and kill him. In this way the youth would gain what he wished, and if he were to die in the enterprise, he would be raised into paradise, in every way identical with the place from which he had been excluded, or if anything, still better. And this is why Loden had very great power and frightened all the princes in the region, whether Moors or Christians, because his messengers were prepared for any sacrifice. Then, Buandulino commented, better one of these fine taverns in Paris, and their girls, whom you can have without paying a forfeit. But what does this story have to do with you? This, when I was 10 years old I was carried off by Loden's men. And I remained there for 5 years. And at the age of 10 you enjoyed all those maidens you're telling me about? And then you were sent to kill somebody? Abdul, what are you saying? Buandulino was worried. I was too little to be admitted immediately to the company of the happy youths, so I was assigned as a servant to a eunuch of the castle who supervised their pleasures. But hear what I discovered. For 5 years I never saw any gardens, because the youths were always chained all together in that sun-baked yard. Every morning the eunuch took from a certain cupboard some silver pots that contained a paste as thick as honey, but of a greenish color. He passed in front of each of the prisoners and fed him that substance. They tasted it and began to recount to themselves and to the others all the delights listed in the legend. You understand? They spent the day with eyes open, smiling, blissful. Towards evening they felt tired, they began to laugh, sometimes softly, sometimes raucously, then they would fall asleep. So, as I slowly grew, I understood the deceit to which they were subjected by Loden. They lived in chains, with the illusion that they were living in paradise, and rather than lose this bliss, they became the instruments of their master's vengeance. If they returned safe from their missions, they were put in chains again, but they began again to see and feel the dreams produced by the green honey. And you? One night, while the others were sleeping, I sneaked into the place where they kept the silver pots of green honey, and I tasted it. Taste, did I say? I gulped down 2 spoonfuls and I began to see wondrous things. Did you feel you were in the garden? No, maybe the others dreamed of the garden because, when they arrived, Loden told them about the garden. I believe the green honey makes you see what you want from the bottom of your heart. I found myself in the desert, or rather, in an oasis, and I saw a splendid caravan arriving, the camels all decked with plumes, and a host of Moors with colored turbans, beating on drums and clashing cymbals. Behind them, on a baldachin carried by 4 giants, there she was, the princess. I can't tell you what she was like, she was so, how can I say it, so dazzling that I recall only the dazzle, a dazzling splendor. But what was her face like? Was she beautiful? I didn't see her face, she was veiled. But, then whom did you fall in love with? With her, because I couldn't see her. In my heart, here, you understand, there was an infinite sweetness, a languor that has never since died. The caravan moved off towards the dunes, and I realized that the vision would never again return. I told myself that I should have followed that creature, but towards morning I began to laugh, with what I believed was joy, while it was the effect of the green honey when its power dies. When I woke the sun was already high, and the eunuch almost caught me still dozing in that place. Since then I have told myself that I should have fled, to find again the distant princess. But you realized it was only the effect of the green honey. Yes, the vision was an illusion, but what I now felt inside was not, it was true desire. When you feel it, it's not an illusion. It's real, but it was the desire of an illusion. By then I wanted never to lose that desire. It was worth devoting my life to it. Abdul eventually managed to find an avenue of escape from the castle, and to rejoin his family, who had by then given him up for lost. Concerned about the revenge of Loden, Abdul's father sent him away from the Holy Land, to Paris. Before fleeing from Loden, Abdul had seized one of the pots of green honey, but, as he explained to Buandulino, he had never tasted it again, for fear that the cursed substance would carry him back to that same oasis, to relive infinitely his ecstasy. He was not sure he could bear the emotion. At this point the princess was with him, and nobody could take her away from him. Better to dream of her as a goal than to possess her in a false memory. Then, as time went on, to find strength for his songs, in which the princess appeared, present in her distance, he had ventured to taste the honey, just barely, on the tip of a spoon, only enough to sense the flavor on his tongue. He had some ecstasies of brief duration, and this is what he had done that evening. Abdul's story fascinated Buandulino, and he was tempted by the possibility of having a vision, however brief, in which the empress would appear. Abdul could not deny him that taste. Buandulino sensed only a slight torpor and the desire to laugh. But he felt his mind stimulated and, curiously, not by Beatrice but by Prester John. So he asked himself if the true object of his desire was not that inaccessible realm, more than the mistress of his heart. So it had been that night. Abdul, almost free of the effect of the honey, and Buandulino, slightly inebriated, had resumed discussing the priest, posing for themselves the question of his existence. And as it seemed that the virtue of the green honey was to make tangible that which has never been seen, they decided the priest did exist. He exists, Buandulino decided, because there are no reasons opposing his existence. He exists, Abdul agreed, because a cleric had told him that, beyond the land of the Medes and the Persians, there are Christian kings who fight the pagans of those regions. Who is this cleric? Buandulino asked eagerly. Boron, Abdul replied, and so it was that the next day they went out to find Boron. He was a cleric of Montbéliard who, a vagrant like his similars, was now in Paris, and a regular visitor to the library of Saint Victoire. And tomorrow he would be God knows where.